My book, The Redistribution Recession, arrives at conclusions about various factors influencing the labor market since 2007. The basic methodology is known as the residual method. Today I want to look at how the residual method works and show how it can, under the right conditions, help quantify factors that would, at first glance, seem impossible to quantify. Many factors potentially reduced labor hours after 2007. Some factors are better understood, or at least more easily quantified, than others. The first step is to quantify the impact of the better-known factors. Next, we subtract that impact from the actual labor hours change to get a residual change. The residual is a model of what would have happened to labor hours but for the influence of the better-known factors. The residual can also be considered a model of the combined impact of all other factors. If the residual is found to be insignificant, that finding is a result and not an assumption. You may not realize it, but you use the residual method in everyday life. Here is an example from a driver who experiences an auto breakdown. For the purposes of this example, let's recognize that an automobile is a complicated piece of machinery. Many drivers do not understand much about how this machinery operates. For example, they may understand that the vehicle runs on gasoline, but realize that they don't know much else about what makes the car move and keeps it running smoothly. When the auto stalls, the driver may attempt to ascertain the cause by starting with the part of the automobile's operation he understands the best, the gasoline. He knows that his car gets 20 miles to the gallon. He knows that his car has a 20-gallon gasoline tank. By multiplication, he knows whether the lack of gasoline causes a stall depends on the number of miles driven since the last fill-up. The next step is to subtract, so to speak, what he knows about gasoline from what he knows has happened to his car. For example, he knows that a stall occurring within 380 miles of his last fill-up means that at least a gallon of gas remains in the tank, so that gas cannot be the explanation for what happened. In this way, he reaches a conclusion about non-gasoline factors without knowing much about them. His conclusion is only as good as the quantification of the factors that he knows, namely the gasoline. For example, if his car had a leaky gas tank and was no longer driving up to 400 miles on a tank, he might be incorrect to conclude that something other than a lack of gasoline stopped his car from running. Instead of considering the automobile breakdown, let's turn to the question at hand, which is why the quantity of labor fell after 2007. One potential factor is the aging of the population, especially movement of the baby boom generation toward normal retirement ages. The first step is to determine what the aging of the population by itself would do to the quantity of labor. To do that, we need to know quantitatively how the age distribution of the population changed after 2007. We also need to know how age is related to hours worked. The product of these two results is an estimate of the impact of aging on hours worked at each point in time after the recession began. As before, the second step is to subtract the impact from the actual hours series to get a residual series. In this case, the impact is negative, so the subtraction of a negative amounts to adding to the actual hours series. In other words, our residual series will be greater than the actual or original series. In this way, the residual method has allowed us to reach conclusions about non-age factors without knowing much about them. To see some of those conclusions, let's look at a chart. This particular chart has monthly data from January 2008 through September 2012. Calendar time is shown on the horizontal axis. The vertical axis measures hours worked per person, where each person not working is counted as a 0 in the average. The scale is an index scale, where 100 means the same hours per capita as when the recession began in December 2007. The hour series is also adjusted for seasonal fluctuations. Looking at the data, we see that hours per capita fell sharply, falling almost down to 90 at the end of 2009, which means that hours fell almost 10%. Hours per capita have come back a little bit, so that the index was about 92 or 93 at the end of the time period shown. Now we can look at step 2, which is to subtract the impact of aging from the gray actual hour series. As I said, this amounts to an addition. The red series is the result, which we have called the residual or age-adjusted hour series. We conclude that the omitted or non-age factors have partly but not fully returned to their pre-recession values, because the red series has partly but not fully returned to its pre-recession values. We also conclude that the omitted factors are most of what happened because the residual series pretty closely follows the actual hour series. Most of what happened to the actual hour series appears to have happened to the age-adjusted series too. This is a nice illustration of how the residual method does not assume that the omitted factors are negligible. Without saying much about those omitted factors, we have reached the conclusion that they are quite important. Instead of distinguishing between age and non-age factors, let's distinguish between redistribution and all other factors affecting the labor market. Payments to the poor and unemployed affect the amount of labor because those payments reduce the reward to working by reducing what a person loses when he works less. Minimum wages are another instrument of redistribution that potentially affects the amount of employment, but for simplicity I will not discuss minimum wages while going through these slides. The first step is to examine the effect of safety net expansions. We need to know how the expansions added to the average marginal tax rate, which is a measure of how government programs affect incentives to work. Just because we have a new set of incentives doesn't necessarily mean we get different behavior, so we need to quantify how much each marginal tax rate point affects the quantity of labor. One way to do that is to look to a prior economic literature devoted to quantifying that effect. The product is an estimate of the impact of safety net expansions on hours worked at each date after the recession began. The second step is to subtract the impact from the actual hour series to get a residual or marginal tax rate constant series. Because the safety net impact is negative, the residual hour series exceeds the actual hour series. Now we can reach conclusions about non-safety net factors without knowing much about them. In order to see some of those conclusions, let's look at another chart. As before, the chart shows calendar time versus an index of hours worked per capita. We don't know that much about the month-to-month dynamics of the safety net's impact, so here we will be looking at yearly data. As we saw before, hours worked per capita falls almost 10% during the recession and still remains far below where it was before the recession began. Now we adjust the actual hour series for the impact of redistribution. The result is the residual or hypothetical redistribution constant hour series shown in red. The residual red series is about 98 after the recession began, which means that the labor market would have been depressed about 2% even if redistribution had remained constant. But the red series is closer to 100 than the actual data, which means that redistribution depressed work hours more than omitted factors did. This is a conclusion, not an assumption. The quality of the conclusion depends on the quality of our quantification of the impact of of redistribution. To learn more about labor market events and how economists quantify them, take a look at my book, The Redistribution Recession, and the multimedia resources provided at redistributionrecession.com.